I'd come back to the States in the summertime and call disc jockeys up and ask them why they weren't playing certain bands, this pre-punk era. After a while, John O'Leary goes, you know, why don't you just go to a broadcasting school and learn how to do this and then get your own radio show? And I thought, oh yeah.
This is Forefront.
Simply put, Mike Halloran's had a big hand in giving a lot of San Diego musicians their big break. Right now you can hear him on FM 94.9, but he's been all over the San Diego music dial. Why? Because Halloran is not about conformity. It's all about the music.
I would like to play some Flogging Molly for you. It's FM 94.9.
Meet the man behind the mic.
Don't forget Sunday, June 8th, all ages show.
For 3 decades, Mike Halloran has shared his passion for music over the airwaves. That great appreciation for music started at a young age. Michael George Halloran was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on January 7th, 1959, the second of 4 kids. His family moved to Detroit when he was still a baby. Thanks to his parents, the house was always well stocked with music and the best stereo equipment. When Mike was 11, his parents sent him to school in England. That's where his mom was from. He was glad to go. After all, he was a fan of the Beatles and the Stones, and that's where they were from. When Mike was around 15, he discovered late-night radio and became a fan of a DJ named John Peel, known for featuring live in-studio band sessions, a concept Mike later adopted on his radio shows. At 16, Mike went to his first live concert, Led Zeppelin. His thirst for live performances and music grew, especially as punk rock emerged. He was even in his own band playing bass. When he was 17, Mike moved back to Detroit. He went to a 9-month broadcasting school and got a job at Detroit's NPR affiliate playing classical music. Then, the big break. Mike convinced the program director to put him on the air. He eventually got his own show and interviewed bands like U2 and The Clash. For the next 20 years, Mike's career in radio and his mission to play alternative programming saw him bounce around the country. 5 stations in Detroit, to 91X in San Diego, to K-Rock in LA, then back to 91X. That's when he also helped launch a station in Seattle, KNDD. Then it was K-Rock New York, back to San Diego at KUPR, later 92.5. Then Y107 in LA, and eventually back to San Diego at 92.1.
On its FM 94.9.
Finally, in 2003, Mike signed on with FM 94.9. He's now music director.
The man probably has thought of more crazy radio promotion tchotchkes than any human being I've ever met. And he's always coming up with a new idea, something new and creative.
Aside from DJ and music director, Mike's also a dad. He and his wife Stephanie have a son, Declan, and a daughter, Rory. A walking encyclopedia of music, a survivor, an innovator, Mike Halloran has made his mark in San Diego and continues to make an impact on music makers and music lovers alike. So, you know, I'm thinking about this. Is it going to ruin your reputation as a rebel if we tell everybody that you grew up in this ritzy suburb with Lee Iacocca's daughters and went to a private school in England and your favorite subject was physics? I mean, this isn't Halloran. This is some guy.
Hopefully it will completely destroy my reputation of being this rebel. I didn't know. Do I have a reputation as being a rebel? Maybe musically.
Well, that's what I meant.
Musically.
Musically, you have a reputation as, and this is a compliment, as an iconoclast. I mean, and I think that's probably a great reputation to have sitting where you are right now, don't you think?
Yeah, I suppose so. It's I don't know. It's like, to me, it's always been about the Detroit ethic was always, you know, with the MC5, the Stooges, Motown. It was about independence. It was about doing something because you love to do it.
At what age were you when you left Detroit and headed over to across the pond?
I was actually 11 when I left, but I'd been hearing about it for pretty much since the first night that the Beatles appeared on They had
Sullivan.
Sullivan's show.
Yeah.
So make a longer story longer. My mom used to tell me about England and how much my grandmother wanted me to go to school over there.
Yeah.
And my grandmother passed on when I was about 18 months old, and my mother used to pine about this all the time. And so eventually I was like, yeah, get out of Detroit, because Detroit was cool. I mean, it was a great place to grow up, but England seemed much cooler because of the Beatles, because of the Rolling Stones, because of the Ermits, all of this. So the idea of going to school over there really appealed to me, and mainly to get away from the nuns. That was pretty much it.
Right, but the Beatles were cool and the Stones were cool.
Beatles, Stones, that was happening. CCR was happening. Sure, Top 40 was a major part of my life, and it wasn't until I got to England that everything really started changing, because the English radio is completely different than American radio. They have Top 40, but whatever sells in England makes it to the Top 40. And the BBC Radio 1, it doesn't matter if it fits the format. In other words, it could be a bagpipe song played by 57 bagpipers and a Paul McCartney song at #1 the next week, or it could be Status Quo or Deep Purple or any band that had a hit at that point.
Your musical awakening sort of came in England as well. And you would figure that because England was the hotbed for the several British invasions. But what I'm talking about is the way the music used to play on the radio because of the BBC. And a guy named John Peel. Who was he?
John Peel, in my opinion, probably the greatest human being that ever lived. And I finally got to meet him once, and it was probably one of the greatest days ever, but he was this disc jockey, if you will, who lived in England for a long time, got some training in Texas. He worked at a radio station in Texas for a short time, and then he went back to do pirate radio in the UK, and eventually wound up on the BBC. And his whole gig was basically to go out and, they called it bin diving in those days, where you just go through these bins in record stores and just pull out things that looked interesting.
Yeah.
And then every once in a while he got a budget and he'd be able to go further, maybe into France or into North Africa, and he'd bring back records from North Africa. So he played everything, and he played independent releases from quote-unquote local bands from other parts of England. So he was the guy that was first responsible for playing what was considered punk rock on the radio. And even though I left England just as this whole thing was bubbling under, I was still playing in a band at this time, but Peel was the guy that turned us on to the weird stuff, so that our musical tastes were way beyond that stuff.
And John Peel on the BBC had some restrictions which really allowed him to explore the music a little more. He wasn't just a DJ. He couldn't just sit there and play record after record, even if he had an unlimited supply of new records. They had rules about things like that, which forced him to get creative.
I think this has been going since probably, when records first existed on the BBC, but they had an archaic law called needle time, and only a certain amount of the hour was allowed to be, they could only drop a needle on a record for a certain amount of that time. I don't know what the percentage is, maybe 20% of the hour, and the rest of it had to be news, information, or music that was recorded live someplace. So knowing those restrictions, John Peel, once he found a band he liked, he would call them up and say, can you do a Peel session? Which everybody now knows as, the Peel sessions that are everywhere. I mean, everybody's done a Peel session at this point, but the idea was he couldn't keep playing the records over and over again. So bands would come into a studio someplace in London and basically record some of their songs from their album onto a piece of tape, in essence, and he would play those on the air, thereby still playing music but not playing the needle time problem. So he didn't have to drop the needle on the record. Eventually those were turned into records, ironically enough.
Massively famous BBC sessions with all the big artists of the time.
I think probably the Beatles probably did, the Rolling Stones, probably more bands than you know. The BBC, because of that whole needle time issue, their library must be the most massive, coolest library in the world to find, one-offs. Because these were really not even produced. These were just kind of like just recorded.
Yeah.
Faders up, mics up, let's go for it.
Go for it.
And that was it. One take through. They couldn't sit there and overdub. It was just kind of like, this is what the band would have sounded like live. Genius stuff. So that was probably one of the biggest influences too. We still do that today here at this station.
Right. So you're listening to Peel, and you're listening to these great sessions. And one other thing appeals to you, pardon the pun, and that, of course, is the way he's interacting with the bands. I mean, this is not some guy just dropping a needle and putting 5 catchy words in between songs. Really, it became the style that you used and have used throughout your career, right? I mean, you got it from him.
Stole everything from him and a few other disc jockeys that I admired back in Detroit in the day. That basically they sounded like they were one guy in a room talking to me, and people have always said that, you know, you're an announcer, but to me an announcer is kind of like somebody who's standing on top of the mountain trying to like explain to everybody what is going on. You know, it's like you watch those old biblical movies where a guy's standing on top of a mountain going, "People of Nazareth." It's like, you know, people at the bottom are like, "What? What's these?" You know, when you're announcing, it's like you're trying to project everybody. But because the microphone's, you know, right in front of my mouth, and the audience in essence is right next to the speaker,
Right.
how many are listening? I don't know. If I start thinking about it, it might scare me. You know, because is it 1? Is it 5? Is it, you know, 250? I don't know.